All right. That look good?
Looks good.
Okay.
Okay. So today we're going to talk about what's on your MVR. Doug, go ahead.
Thanks, Jason. So I am the expert on what's on your MVR. No, does that sound kind of creepy? I hope not.
A little bit.
So, several years ago here at the Trust, we started doing this program of monitoring MVRs because we recognize one of our greatest loss exposures is driving. And it makes you question, who do we put behind the wheel? Obviously, the person who has the most control over whether we have an accident or not is going to be the driver. And so as we look at this, we can go back over time and we can take a look at what kind of exposures we've had in our pool. Back in 2012, we had almost a $6 million loss year when it came just to auto liability. And so that's a huge potential problem there. I mean, that's, kind of an example of what a well, I hope it's probably not a good idea to say worst case scenario because it could be worse. But over the last couple of years, we've seen some definite decline over that. Hopefully, our paying attention to who we have driving vehicles has been a driving factor in that, or at least helping in that. In 2013, those losses were down to $2.5 million. 2014, about just under $1 million. 2015 crept up over $1 million. Again, so far this year, we're about 850,000. So we need to stop right here. No more accidents the rest of this year, please. But this is a significant exposure, and so we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing? What's our driver selection, driver qualification process that we have? And so we have been encouraging people through the TAP award program and just through best practices and risk management of encouraging our members to make sure that we put a little extra effort into identifying qualifications for our drivers. And part of that is looking at motor vehicle records. It could also be testing your employees, observing their driving and, understanding who our drivers are. It's employees and sometimes it's even volunteers. A driver qualification, sometimes could be represented by a metric like this where we actually go and we say, what's acceptable as far as how many tickets you have and how many accidents that you've had. In fact, we kind of, encourage our members to take a look at this and adopt a policy that will clearly explain, what does it take to be authorized to drive for our entity? And we really think that should be something better than just having a valid driver's license, because we've seen some really bad driving records where people still have a valid driving license. And as we're going to show you as we go through here, that does actually represent some significant risk that we can control by, exercising some discretion over who we give keys to, who we're putting behind the wheel. Lots of times people will ask, don't we need an employee's permission to run their motor vehicle record? And actually, as government entities, we have an exception for running motor vehicle records when it's a part of our normal operations. And of course, identifying who we are going to put behind the wheel of our government vehicles is part of normal operations. So the answer to that actually is no. We have our drivers' information. We can take a look at their records as part of our process of identifying who we're going to put behind the wheel. What about privacy? Of course, you do want to protect your driver's privacy, and there is some information in there that we want to make sure we protect. However, the motor vehicle records reports that we send out really don't have much more information besides just a name and number of violations and types of violations. Your actual MVR has your name, and it doesn't even show your whole driver's license number. It does show a birthday. So those are identifying information, but it doesn't show a full driver's license number, social security number, anything like that. But even with that, we still want to try and protect people's privacy, keep these records, any identifying information from, getting out to the public. We want to protect that. Do we include elected officials in our driver qualification program? If they're driving, yes. And sometimes there's even potential for if they're driving their own vehicles, regardless of what type of employee this is. If they're driving on government business, then there is a potential there for liability exposure to the entity. But for the most part, we're concerned with who's driving our vehicles. What if we don't own any vehicles? Again, you know, if you don't own any vehicles, then you probably are operating personal vehicles on entity business at some point or another. And again, there is potential exposure there. So we still want to think about who is driving, you know, on our behalf, even if it's in their own private vehicle. You know, what kind of other things we look at, you know, is it our business if they get tickets when they're off the clock? And I'll see a lot of people, they'll say, you know, yeah, I've got a couple tickets, but I didn't get them while I was working, so it's not my employer's, you know, it's not any of their business. So is it our business if our employees are getting tickets off the clock? Well, we believe yes, it is, because, you know, a driver doesn't necessarily change their driving habits just because they're on the clock. So if we've got a driver who, you know, gets one speeding ticket a year, that's a driver who has a habit of speeding. And that is our concern, because the all likelihood how they drive off the clock is going to be somewhat representative, if not totally representative, of how they drive when they are on the clock driving for us. This is what an MVR looks like. This is my MVR here anyway. And so you can see my driver's license number is covered up. You only see the last 4 digits there. My birthday's on there, and you know, so I'm sharing with you what my birthday is. Okay, I trust you. If there was any violations on here, there'd be additional pages, but you can see it says end of record at the bottom of the page, so there's no violations there. And this is normal. This is average. I want you to remember that. A normal driver has no violations on their driving record. Sometimes we get a little we get this idea that, you know, 1 or 2 tickets, that's normal. It really isn't, and I'll show you what those numbers look like here in just a second. We also encourage you, if you aren't in the Trust MVR program, at least check your employees' MVRs once a year. And if you have employees who live out of state, they're operating on an out-of-state driver's license, you need to get them to help to provide you with an MVR from their home state at least once a year. Our program only accesses the state of Utah driver's license database, and so we don't see records for Idaho or Colorado or Arizona drivers. So if you have drivers with out-of-state licenses because they're students or they live in another state, then you'll need to get these records from another source. You also should check your MVRs for new hires. We need to be, you know, aware of what kind of accidents our employees have had. So accidents don't necessarily show directly on a basic MVR report. We can run reports where we can see whether violations are the result of an accident, but as a general rule, we don't see accidents on the MVR report there. So if you know, you should be keeping track of employees who have accidents, especially if they're involving your vehicles on the clock, and keep track of that. Your program of identifying drivers should include, you know, observations of their driving as well. You know, pre-hire checks, that should be part of your decision process, especially if that employee's job will involve driving. Monthly monitoring, we do this for you. So we, at the Trust, have a requirement that if you're in our auto liability program, that you need to submit your drivers, your authorized driver list to us. And when you do that, we include them in a monthly monitoring program, and we send you a report every month on your drivers, if their licenses are valid and how many and what kind of violations they have on their license. So that's something that's available to you at no extra cost as a Trust member. It's very convenient and really enables you to be able to keep a good eye on what's going on with your driver's records, because it can change from time to time. Lots of times we'll have people say, well, you know, the driver has a valid license because they showed it to me and it has a valid date on it. Well, you know, just because someone has a card in their pocket with a valid date on it doesn't mean that license is valid. There's a number of reasons why that license could be suspended or invalidated or you know, otherwise disqualified, even if it's within a current time frame. So we need to make sure that we are only putting legal, valid drivers behind the wheel who we believe who represent the lowest risk possible and are going to be safe drivers. You control the risk by selecting who you put behind the wheel and then monitoring, their driving and their driving record. All licenses aren't necessarily valid. In fact, we identify a lot of invalid licenses. And most invalid licenses that we see are a result of problems with CDL licenses. And we'll talk about that a little bit here in just a minute. Also, monitoring your driver's driving record can help you identify training needs. If you see drivers with really bad driving records, we may want to look at defensive driving, and we've got that coming up in November. So that's something that should be done from time to time. And also, we feel it motivates the drivers. If you know that your employer is looking at your record every month, and that has a bearing on your work, if you're a driver, you have to continue to be authorized to drive, then you'll be motivated to be a safer driver, a legal driver, and keep your driving record clean. So what have we found doing our motor vehicle records program? Well, first thing that was really surprising was the number of invalid licenses. We found over the years now that when a list of drivers is initially submitted to us to add to the program, about 2% wind up being invalid. Either they've got a suspended license, or the license is expired, or there's some sort of issue with the CDL license that has caused the license to be denied. But really, it's as high as 2% until we start to check these programs. And that's why it's really important. You don't ever want to have a problem where one of your employees gets in an accident, or winds up being in the news, and we find out, well, hey, you got a person out there driving the county, city, district vehicle that didn't even have a valid license. I mean, that's pretty basic, but we do see quite a bit of that. There's suspended licenses. Expired licenses, unfortunately, are fairly common. Lots of times employees kind of procrastinate renewing their licenses, and we do see expired licenses and denied licenses. Again, denied licenses, usually folks around a medical issue or a CDL license requirement. Now, this is a sample list of all the different license statuses that we may see on an MVR. So one of the main things we look for on the MVR is what is the license status. And what we want to see is valid. And so the vast majority of the time in that column, we'll just see valid, which means that's a valid license. But here's a list of a couple dozen different types of license statuses. Some of them are invalid licenses. Some of them just depict a learner permit or a motorcycle learner permit or something like that. And so, that's things that we see rather common. Disqualified there in the middle of the screen is something that may come up on a CDL license if there's a problem with the qualifications for a CDL license. Down towards the bottom there, DMed. We'll see that, denied medical requirement. Sometimes that could just be someone with a regular driver's license who has a medical condition that they need to go get a doctor checkup before their license is validated again, or sometimes that's a problem with the medical card on a CDL license. And it's really important to note here that when your CDL license, if you are a CDL operator, if your license has a problem with the CDL requirements, such as your medical exam, your medical card, and it goes into denied status because you didn't submit the medical card, or you didn't check the right box on the form or whatever, that invalidates your license, not just the CDL portion. Lots of times people will think, okay, well, I'm not using my CDL these days anyway. I'm just driving a normal car. Usually, if there's a problem with your CDL license, it puts your entire license in denied status. So be really careful about that. If you have a CDL license and you're not using it, you're not planning on renewing it, you're going to have to make sure that you take extra steps to get that removed so that you don't wind up with a denied license for not following your CDL requirements.
Hey, Doug?
Yeah.
We did have a clarification question regarding elected officials. Kyle asked, what happens when they reach unacceptable status? It's not likely that we can prohibit them from driving, even on government business. They are elected. what's the punishment? Without punishment, why bother?
Well, you're absolutely right. You're not going to stop them from driving their personal car to meetings and so forth. And, you know, that's, you have quite a bit of protection there from liability anyway. If someone's driving their personal car, their insurance is primary. So if they get in an accident, even if they're on, you know, government business, there's still their personal insurance that is going to cover that accident in the primary position. We're only potentially, you know, have exposure if the cost of that claim exceeds the limits of their insurance, which is possible, and even then it's not guaranteed that we've got liability exposure, but it is potential. So as long as they're operating their own vehicle, the amount of risk we have is limited somewhat, but you definitely would control whether you're putting them in a city-owned vehicle, and you would probably need to have that as part of your driver qualification policy. That's part of your policies and procedures, your policy manual, that says anybody driving a city vehicle must be authorized, and this is the policy that we follow to authorize those drivers, and that would apply to elected officials as well for operating an actual entity-owned vehicle. Does that work?
Yeah, that's great. And I also think a little peer pressure doesn't hurt either, to be able to you know, let that elected official know that, hey, nobody else in the organization has any citations, and you've got 12.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll show you what that looks like here in just a minute. I mentioned all these invalid licenses that can pop up, and I think it's really important to point this out, especially to those of you who have CDLs. When you do your, when you renew your CDL, when you renew your medical certificate every 2 years, you have this form that you have to submit in this commercial driver's license medical self-certification form. Has to be submitted before your process is complete. Now, at the bottom of this page, there's a line where you sign for your signature and date. And everybody gets that. I think they get down there, do the signature, but they miss these boxes here. So this is in the middle of the page here where it says check only one box. And if you don't check one of these boxes, guess what happens? Your license goes into denied status. And not only does your license become denied, not just your CDL, but your license status is denied. Not only does that happen, but they don't tell you about it, which always kind of amazes me that they'll put your license in denied status and not even send you a letter. So it's really important you make sure and do this when you're going through your medical certification. So for most of us, you're going to be checking one of the two boxes there in the interstate driver box on the left-hand side of the form there. And you're probably checking the non-accepted if you want your CDL license to be something that's unrestricted that you could use for any type of employment. You know, there's more detail there, but just make sure that you select one of those boxes and check them, or your license isn't going to be any good. Other things that we found, you know, in our program of monitoring drivers right now, we have over 13,000 drivers that we have in our program that we produce a driving report on every month. Out of those 13,000 drivers, there's about 2,000 violations currently on those records, which has actually gone down significantly. It used to be over 3,000, and so we've seen a drastic reduction in the number of total violations that are on our drivers' records out there. We have about 1,600 of those 13,000 drivers who have one violation or more on their driving record. So what does that actually mean? Well, that means 12% of our drivers have one ticket or more on their driving record, and 88% of them have perfectly clean driving records. That is the norm, and I really want to stress that. A normal driving record has no violations, and that should be our goal, is to have a clean driving record. Other things, you know, that's kind of interesting to look at is drivers with just one violation. That's about 10% of the 13,000. Drivers with two violations is less than 2% of the 13,000. So right there with one or two violations, that's less than 12% of our drivers out of that 88%. So what's left over is just a fraction of 1%, you know, that we've got left. Drivers with three violations are about 1/3 of 1% of all the drivers. So we're starting to see this is a pretty small group when we start getting up above 2 violations. Even above 1 violation, it's a pretty small group. If you've got 4 or more violations, you're in, you are 1 in 526, the worst one out of 526 drivers, on average in our pool. If you have 5 or more violations, and there's a few of them, and we're working on these, but you're 1 in 1,250. So really, if you've got a driver who says, I've got 3 or 4 tickets, it's no big deal. It is a big deal. If you have 3 or 4 tickets on your driving record, you're in a very small minority in our pool. Now that has changed a lot over time. When we first started our MVR monitoring program, our violator rate was closer to 20%. And so over the years, with monitoring our drivers' records and encouraging our members to adopt qualification standards, we've lowered that violator rate from 20 down to 12%. And so we've seen significant improvement there, and that drives down our risk that we have associated with driving vehicles as well. So that's really important. So MVR tells us, how likely we are to have an accident. That's one thing that our MVR does tell us, that's on there. And the statistics we can look at actually show us that if you have 1 ticket on your current MVR, you are 49% more likely to have an accident in the next 3 years. That's a significant risk increase. If you have 2 tickets, you're 86% more likely to be in an accident in the next 3 years. If you have 3 tickets, you're more than twice as likely to have an accident in the next 3 years as compared to someone who has a clean driving record. At 4 tickets, it's 136%, 5 tickets is 168%, 6 tickets is over 200%, or over 3 times as likely to have an accident in the next 3 years. The same thing applies to if you've had a car accident. If you have an at-fault car accident in the last 3 years, you are 63% more likely to have another one in the next 3 years. And so this is important. This information isn't readily available on your MVR. Employers, you should be keeping track of your employees who've had accidents on the job. If you've had 2 at-fault accidents in the last 3 years, you're 150% more likely to have another accident in the next 3 years. And if you've had 3 at-faults in the last 3 years, you're 3 times as likely to have another one in the next 3 years as someone who hasn't had any accidents. Another thing that's on your driving record that may be of interest to you is the point system. How many points do you have on your driver's license? So here's an example of how many points you might get for different types of violation. If you have a reckless driving citation, that's 80 points. If you got a speeding ticket where you were doing 21 miles or more over the speed limit, that's 75 points. If you have a ticket for failure to yield or following too close or going the wrong way on a one-way street, that's a 60-point ticket. If you have a ticket for doing 11 to 20 miles an hour over, that's 55-point ticket. 1 to 10 miles an hour over is 35-point ticket. Most other violations are 50-point tickets on average if you look at them. So that's kind of on average, you're going to be looking at probably at least 50 points, per moving violation. And this can result in a possible suspension of your license. But again, for your license to be suspended, you're going to have a lot of tickets. And so our driver qualification system should preclude us from having any drivers with so many points that they're in risk of losing their license due to suspension. If you are under 21 years of age, the driver's license division will look at your license and consider a suspension once you hit 70 points. In fact, this happened with one of my kids, years ago when he was still a minor, and he had an accident and it bumped his points up, the ticket he got. And we had to go down to the driver's license division and, talk to him about them considering a suspension on him. That could be 1 to 12 months suspension. If you're over 21, it takes 200 or more points for you to be in risk of suspension, and that's a 3 to 12 month suspension if that happens to you. Your points do reduce over time. So if you go a year without any moving violations, they will drop 50% of the points off your record. So the ticket will still be on your record, but your point balance will drop down. If you go 2 years without any moving violations, they'll take all the points off of your record. Even though the tickets will still show on there, they'll take all the points off. Now at 3 years, most tickets, unless they're drug or alcohol offenses, will drop off. And so pretty much at 3 years, it's automatic that the points and the ticket will disappear from your standard driving record report. The record's still there in the system, but it won't show up on your standard MVR. If you do have a drug or alcohol offense, those will stay on your record for 10 years on your standard MVR record. If you take a driver improvement course, like our defensive driver 4-hour course that we sometimes teach, that will get you a 50-point reduction on your point balance, but you can only take that once every 3 years. So that is another thing that's available to you. So in summary, what's on your driving record? Well, information about whether your license is valid, information about what kind of violations you have on your license, and information that we can actually translate into understanding of the amount of risk that we have associated with an individual driver. So we encourage all of you to make sure you have a driver authorization program, that requires drivers to meet a standard to be able to drive for you. And that standard should be higher than just having a valid license. I really think that, if you look at 200 points, that's probably going to be 4, 5, 6 tickets, and that's way too high. You could have someone with 6 tickets and still have a valid license, and I think that represents an unreasonable amount of risk. And so make sure your driver authorization program actually represents a level of risk that you want. We want to make sure that we're driving legally. Therefore, we want to make sure our drivers have valid licenses, and that can change from month to month. And so our monitoring program gives you the ability to see that all of your drivers have valid licenses. When we pay attention to this, it helps us control our risks. That record is something that reflects drivers' habits, and we need to be considering that, when we give someone the keys of our vehicles and send them out on the road, because that is a significant life or death risk that's out there. So we encourage all of you to set a goal to have a perfectly clean driving record. That is what 88% of you already have. Those of you who do have a few tickets on your record, make sure you're driving safe and legal, and so that those tickets will come off your record eventually and have a perfectly clean driving record so that you represent a lower risk. And that's it. Jason, any other questions out there?
I don't have any that have come in yet, but folks, you can type those into the chat box or the Q&A box, and we will answer those right now. Good job, Doug. I appreciate time you've put in on this, and I think that helps to explain. We seem to get a lot of questions about, particularly on the CDL issues and keeping those licenses current, and I think this will be a good explanation for people to understand what's up with that. But for Kyle's question, I think that peer pressure is an important factor there. If people know they're being monitored, they're going to drive better, and that's anybody, whether you're elected official or the guy that was just hired last week. So, all right, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. Brent, you got anything to add?
Nothing else. Great job, Doug.
Okay, thank you.
Final word, Doug.
Thanks. Thank you all for being with us this morning, and if there's any way we can help you with your MVR monitoring program, or if you have any questions about it, or if you haven't even submitted your list yet, give us a call and let us get you going in that program, or answer any questions you have about that program, because it is a really valuable and convenient service that's available to you that we're pretty proud of. So go out there, have a great day, and be safe. Thanks.
All right, we did have one question come in